Okay, good afternoon, ladies, gentlemen, and those who are undecided. Today we're going to talk about voicing, amplifier voicing. That is a ratted out Radio Shack speaker. I actually have another one that's just like it, but the cone wasn't ripped and re-glued, and it's actually not a bad speaker. It works okay as a guitar speaker. So what affects the voice of a speaker in an amp, and what the hell is the voice? What do we mean by the voice? So it's really simple. When we think of the human voice, some people have deep voices with a lot of bass, Johnny Cash maybe, and some people have very high-pitched voices, soprano opera singers. That works. I can't think of any of those. Sorry, I'm a rock and roll guy. So anyway, when we refer to the voicing of an amp, we refer to the frequencies that it produces and how easily it produces those frequencies. Some amplifiers are, they have a lot of treble, some have a lot of bass, some have a lot of mid-range, and some of them have different spikes in there. So we're going to test it. The speaker is a big part of it, and changing a speaker can definitely change the voice of the amp. The other is the tubes and the capacitors. So there are many variants. If you want to change the voice of your tube amp, you can change the types of tubes that are in there, maybe to a different manufacturer. And certain tube vendors and speaker vendors will have terms and things about different voices, and this is a trebly speaker, and they use lovely terms like sparkly and chime. Sparkle is high treble. That is your very bright sound. When you think of a sparkly amp, maybe a Fender Twin Reverb, something like that, that's kind of good. When they think of chime, they usually talk about Vox amps, but the chime is generally associated with the Celestion speaker. That is a mid treble. It's the treble before the sparkle. It's just below that. So it doesn't have it's kind of a non-sustainy treble, and they reference it as if the pitch of a chime being struck with a hammer. I know it doesn't mean doodly squat. So I've sort of devised a half-baked test, and let's go talk about that real quick, and then we have some audio samples to listen to. Okay, so the interwebs is my friend. This is a website called onlinetonegenerator.com, and this is a frequency sweep generator. You can name your bottom frequency and your top frequency, which our bottom frequency is 40 hertz. The bottom frequency a guitar itself will actually produce is about 44 hertz-ish, and a 5-string bass will go down to maybe 33 hertz. So we're going to start at 40, and we're going to sweep up to 5600. About 5400 is normally the top note of a 24 fret guitar. Yeah, you get some higher harmonics out of that, but let's just be realistic. I think this will demonstrate our point. The sweep is going to be 20 seconds long, and it's going to be a sine wave. So I'm going to create an audio file that I can play through various guitar amps, and we will listen to the frequency sweeps and how they sound different from amp to amp. I'm going to try to do some bass lines here. This is a basement workshop. This is not a perfect soundproofed room with all the silency crap on the walls, and there might be background noise, but we're going to use a good quality condenser mic, and we should be able to hear differences from one to the other, and at least determine why and how amps have different voices. Okay, so although I'm going to be secretive with what some of the other amps are, our first amp we're going to start with is one of my own creations. It's the Braddock by Mr. V. It's got a 10-inch speaker in it, and you can read about it on our website, mrvamps.com, so go read about it so then you know what it's about. But effectively it is a two-channel, kind of a two-channel. It's got different input impedance, and depending on which one of the two input jacks you plug into will give you a different voice. And it has the most simple controls. It has a volume knob and a tone knob, and the speaker in this cabinet is not centered. The speaker is off center, so I'm trying to position the mic just a little bit off the dust cap, so we're getting cone and dust cap together. I know, not super scientific, and our microphone is an MXL 603S pencil condenser mic. I find it's very sensitive, and it generally gets some pretty accurate sound. So this is the Braddock in channel 2, or actually no, 1. I'm sorry. The inside jack is 1. So this is the more sensitive input jack. Okay, so what are we looking at here? This is actually a frequency thing that I fed it. Now this is a stereo file. This is left channel, right channel, but obviously our outputs are going to be mono because they're guitar amps. And this is a 20-second file, so we'll just zoom in here real quick and see what we're looking at. So you can see that despite the fact that the frequency is continuing to go up, the volume is equal. So that's what we were putting into our amplifier. This is what we got out of Braddock. Let's take a look. Let's zoom over. Yeah, there we go. We got it all. This is what we got out of Braddock. We got subdued bass in the low range. We got a nice big fat sort of a bottom end, a little bit of a scoop there, and then here's our mid-range, relatively flat, with a little bit of a boost in the lower treble region and a bit more subdued in the higher treble region. It is an open back cabinet, but considering what we put into it, and this is what we get out of it, that would explain, that is the quote-unquote voice of the amp. Now you can see it. Okay, next amplifier, but I can't tell you what it is. Okay, so that's the frequency response from Braddock. I was originally going to switch over to the lower gain input, but when I did, I actually looked at the waves coming out of it, and they're basically the same, just with a different volume level. So I think the voice of this amp is generally alike, whether you're in input 1 or 2. It's just a matter of how much gain, which will kind of affect your distortion tunes. So we're going to move on to our next amplifier and try that, but I can't tell you what the next amplifier is because I want you to not have any preconceived notions, so I'll tell you what it is after we check it. What I will tell you is the next amp is a 2-channel amp, so it has, and it's not necessarily a clean and distortion, it's like 2 different voices. So we'll give that a listen, and then I'll show you what it is, and we'll see how that differs from what Braddock sounds like on a boring, mundane frequency sweep. Okay, so that was a where's our microphone? There it is. Okay, that was a Vox AC 15, and the tone cut is turned down to 0, so that should allow all frequencies through. Volume is there, and EQ is flat. We did 2 sweeps there, first on the normal channel and then on the top boost channel. And looking at it on the graph, which I will show you these graphs, very, very different voicing from the Braddock amp that we started with. So let's move on to our next amplifier and do some sweeps, and then we'll talk about what amp it actually was. Okay, so here's the frequency sweeps from the Vox AC 15. Let's just look at one since they're roughly the same. Take a look at that one. You got a generally modest bass, modest mid-range, and extremely strong treble. These are bright amps. That's probably why they have that tone cut knob on there to roll off the top frequencies. This is a very, very different voice than the Braddock amp had. Okay, next amp.
2 here, or actually amp number 3, because we just did what? We did the Braddock and the Vox, so this is number 3. This is Mr. Big. This is one of my own creations. The circuit is very similar to a Fender Twin Reverb. We did both the normal channel, which is the one without any effects, and the one that does have the reverb and tremolo in it, but those were turned off. And I did get a little bit different response from each channel. They do have different tubes in the preamp section of each one, so behavior being a little bit different, and there are 4 Weber Signature Alnico speakers in there. Yeah, when you see the audio clips of the different frequency sweeps, you will see what I'm talking about. This has a totally different voice than our Vox previously, and also a totally different voice than the Braddock amp. Very, very different, very cool. This is a response graph from the Mr. Big amplifier, and you can see one of the things I really like about this amp. I sort of designed it with high fidelity principles in mind, and you can see we have a lot of low bass and a lot of sort of mid bass, and then we kind of scoop the mid-range out, and then we have a nice sparkly treble. Very different from the profile of the Vox and the Braddock. The Braddock being fairly balanced, the Vox being very treble, and Mr. Big giving a big smiley face. How many of you guys have a graphic equalizer on your home stereo and you set it to a smiley face? I always thought that somebody like Chet Atkins or Dwayne Eddy would like an amp that sounded like this. I know I do. Okay, next amp. Okay, that amp number 4, are we up to 4? That amp number 4 was a Vox TB18. It's a Tony Bruno model. It's a Vox, it's got a Celestion speaker in it, but it has 6 V6s in it like a US amp. All the EQs are set to flat, the reverb is off, and the volumes were just set at whatever was appropriate to feed my microphone. A different frequency sweep, different voice big time than the other Vox. I don't know that this one has some other characteristics that were similar to the other Vox, but it definitely has some unique stuff. This will be really cool when we finally look at the outputs. Okay, this is recorded slightly louder than the AC-15, but this is the TB-18. You can see there's a little bit of a hump in here, which seems, or a little bit of a dip there, but we definitely have more mid-range, and then we have more of the lower treble, where the AC-15 seemed to peak out a little bit later. So this is a sort of a meatier sounding amp than the AC-15. The AC-15 would be more sparkly, if you will, but it's a Vox. It's supposed to chime because it's got a Celestion speaker, right? Well, anyway, the TB-18 does sound a little bit different, and it definitely has a response curve to reflect that difference. Okay, next amp. Okay, that was an Epiphone Blues Custom. It's a 30 watt amp. It's got 2 6L6s in it. I admittedly have crappy 6L6s in it, and I intend to put some better ones in it. But the first sweep was on the 30 watt mode where the tubes are in push-pull, and the second was in the 15 watt mode where they're in Class A. And I think there was a different frequency response. We'll be able to see that on the scope. The speakers in this are Eminence Lady Luck. They're made by Eminence for Epiphone in these, and allegedly the speaker was supposed to, quote-unquote, not color the sound. If I forget to tell you what speakers are in these as we go along, I'll try to post it in the comments. Okay, so here's our responses from the Epiphone Blues Custom. They look fairly similar in voice, but the second one here is the single-ended mode, and it actually just looks a little bit flatter and a little bit, sort of a little bit fuzzier. So people that say, single-ended amps sound warmer, well, there's more mid-range here and more bass over here than there was in this sweep, despite the fact that we do have about the same height of peaks here, and a little bit more of a treble peak in the push-pull mode. So the push-pull mode would probably sound a little, quote-unquote, brighter. Let's view this one a little bit more closely. And this is a lot flatter response than many of the other amps. This is a very customizable amp. The different frequency knobs, the treble, middle, bass, are extremely versatile, and you can add a lot to the sound. Add a lot of bass, add a lot of treble, add a lot of mid, take it a lot out, whatever. It can almost be a fidgety amp, because right out of the box, flat, it's not necessarily the prettiest sounding amp. You can get a lot of good tones out of it, but you have to work for it. Okay, next amp. Okay, so that was a PV Encore 65. It is a tube amp. It is allegedly 65 watts with two 6L6s. The controls are set to flat, and the speaker is a PV Scorpion. Okay, this is our frequency response graph for the PV Encore 65. Low bass is a bit subdued, mid bass okay, mid range fairly flat, high mid bass or high mids here we kind of peak in, and then we have a little bit more treble. But this is a lot flatter of an amp than we saw with, if you think about what we saw with particularly the Voxes, where you have a very strong treble. This is a fairly flat, subdued amp, and there's a lot of tweakability in this one. There's a lot of pull for bright switches, or pull for fat switches, or thick, or whatever. So this is kind of this amp is designed to sort of flatline out of the box with all the stuff set at 0. And the speaker, being a general purpose speaker, also used in some PA equipment, it seems to suit this. So a very customizable amp. Has a lot more in common with the Blues Custom than one would think. I'm sure by now my family loves me listening to test tones flying out of the basement here. This is a PV Basic 40. It's actually marketed as a bass amp, and it definitely had a better or a bigger response on the bass end than a lot of the other ones do. This has a mystery PV speaker. It wasn't a branded speaker, but it's probably whatever their house speaker was for this particular amp. So we'll move on to the next amplifier. Okay, a quick look at our frequency sweep from the PV Basic 40. Being a bass amp, we do see some pretty strong response in the bass area. And the mid-range is a little more subdued, a little less. But some surprising spikes up here in the treble region. Treble on a bass guitar is kind of considered the growl. So. And you can easily dial that up or down. And this is with the amp set flat, so I'm sure if I turn the bass up, I could get this to go significantly stronger. So a very sort of different looking pattern to what we've seen before. Okay, this amp was a Epiphone Valve Senior. It's a 18 watt 2.6 V6 amp with a 16 ohm Lady Luck 12-inch speaker. So that's an Eminence 4 Epiphone type speaker. Okay, next. And this is the frequency response from the Epiphone Valve Senior. A little bit of a bass hump, a little bit of a low bass dip. Moderate mid-range. The sort of high mid, a little bit stronger, fairly strong treble, and then we kind of roll off on the higher treble. I'm sort of surprised about that notch there, though. That notch is a bit of a surprise. I really do like the sound of this amp. This is a good sounding amp, and it sounds very nice driven. It's one of the better sounding small amps. You can just really turn up the gain and go and play some good rock music, and you don't need a lot of stomp boxes. So I really like this amp. I know I feel like as this video is droning on, I'm looking at the footage from before, and these clips are getting shorter and shorter, going, get this over with. But I think this is really cool analyzation. Okay, a couple more amps, let's keep going. Okay, that's the Les Paul Jr. Gibson amp reissue from about 2008 with the 8-inch speaker. The amp and the speaker are made by Mojo Tone. I'm fairly certain. I dissected that thing in another video. Okay, next amp. Okay, so this is the frequency response graph, roughly, from the Gibson Les Paul Jr. You can see, being an 8-inch speaker, it's not able to carry a lot of bass, but fairly even mid, and a little bit of enhanced treble. This amp to me sounds a little dark. It doesn't have as much top end as I would like it to have, but it actually works well with single coil guitars, and considering the Les Paul Jr. amp was made for a Les Paul Jr. guitar that's only got a bridge pickup, so that's going to be a more trebly sound anyway. And the Melody Maker and the Les Paul Jr. were single coil, so single coil, bridge pickup, that's going to be a trebly pickup, so this was probably to compensate. Now this is not an original, this is the repro, so I don't know how close they got to the original voicing, but that's my thinking. Okay, that was our Gibson Skylark GA5T from video a day ago. That's the one with the dreaded tone sucking circuit. Boy, you will love to see that frequency sweep. It's amazing because when you look at the frequency sweep and compare it to another amp up there, I think you'll probably see why I really royally like this thing. It's amazing. I'm shocked at the frequency sweep, the way it looks on the wave pattern. Compares a lot to another amp here that I'm also very, very fond of, with one exception. Okay, one last amp and then we'll get out of here. Craziest looking frequency sweep yet. We have, let's just imagine this is flatlined. Because remember, with the Gibson quote-unquote tone-sucking circuit, I've said you want to turn down your treble. That's why. There's a lot of it. But imagine this. We start with moderate bass. We subdue the mids a bit. We have lower treble coming up, upper mids, and then we have this big big giant wall of treble up here. But this amp actually, in its frequency response, forms the same smiley face that Mr. Big does. That's probably why this sounds good to me. I like amps that generally are a little more subdued in the mids and have a more rich bass and a more rich treble. This one probably has over-the-top treble, but again, if I roll that treble back, squish it down, I get a miniature sound like Mr. Big. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? But the slightly subdued mids just sound warmer and friendlier to me. It's a nice, really cool sounding amp, and it sounds really great overdriven. I'm just afraid to damage that little speaker by beating it up too hard. Okay, one more amp. Okay, the final amp here is the Cordovox, the converted Cordovox, the one I referred to as Polka Warrior. If you heard, the frequency sweep was still going on. The transformer and the capacitors in there are so enormous that it actually took this thing almost a good 15 seconds of being off before it stopped producing sound. Crazy. If you're curious more about this, this has got two 12-inch Hepner speakers and it runs, 7591 power tubes. Really unique thing, but very different frequency sweep. So let's go look at the frequency sweeps and we'll talk about them real quick. Okay, finally we have the Polka Warrior and its frequency sweep. Not a lot of bass there. Very strong mid, and a little bit more subdued, but substantial mid treble and a sort of a lower higher treble. So comparing this to Mr. Big, which is a big smiley face, this is a bit more of a frowny face. Totally different sound. This one really roars when you drive it, and it gives what I would, associate with a higher gain, almost a Marshall-y kind of roar. And you can see that just a very, very different frequency response. So anyway, this is enough. We've done enough. So thank you very much for sticking with me if you did. And hopefully you'll get an idea, just by looking at the different sweeps and the way the different amps behave, what we actually mean by amp voicing, and why all of these amps sound different. So next time you tell your wife you want a different guitar amp, and she says you already have a guitar amp, you can tell her, yes, but this amp that I want to buy has a completely different voice, and it sounds like a different amp. There's your excuse. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.